Have you ever been learning something and it's kind of shifting the way that you think about things and or maybe enlightening you and your brain is on fire and your resting heart rate is elevated and it's all you can think about when you're not focused on something? Well, this has been me the last few days. I've been digging into these player stats and it's really changing the way I think about the sport in a lot of ways. But the biggest one is I am a true sports fan. I love stats. I'm really seeing the way that these player stats are going to change the ability for a fan to engage with the sport. And I couldn't be more excited about it. And I can't wait to share it with you. So let's get into it right now. Okay, so I'm going to get into three major assumptions that I made about these player stats when we started talking about them, that many of which are completely shattered, and then some are kind of evolving based on new information. So I'm excited to share those with you. And so I'm going to take you into my computer, but the first thing I want to do is kind of show you the basis of what these player stats are. So this is an article on our website, and it goes over what the top 5 stats are and how we're going to be using them. So we're going to be tracking race entries, number of races a player participates in, race entry percentage, so of the total races available, what percentage does a player partake in, entry to win percentage, which will track the percentage of those races performed in that are won. And so those 3 stats are kind of basic ones, and they probably also won't mean too much early on in the season. It's kind of like batting average, where the first 2 weeks don't mean much because you can go on a hot streak or a cold streak and completely change that. So these stats, while we'll be tracking them through the season, are really going to apply towards the end of the season. And when there's a high performer in specific elements that have big impacts on races, and like your hyper specialists, you really should see the entry to win percentage, I'm hoping, reflect how big that impact is, even if they don't have a ton of total work across all races. Okay, so again, not going to show a ton of information up front, but what will is this element score and impact score. And this is what I'm actually most excited about, because this is something that really paints a picture within a race, within a match, within a season, obviously, but even within a single race, you can see some interesting things that you didn't expect. So what is an element score? An element score is the element value, which is a number applied by the league to a specific movement within a race that helps to quantify how important it is to the race outcome. So it assesses things like time it takes to perform the rep, the amount of energy, the amount of skill it takes, the amount of risk to perform effectively, and balances that against a rep that's super easy to perform, super quick to perform, anybody on the team can do, et cetera, et cetera. So it overcomes the just raw rep number and starts to actually measure the effect a single player has on a race or a match or a season. And so this element score is the number of reps performed times the element value. And so we're going to show you an example of an element value here in a second. And so this is within a single set. So a single parameter of movements at this element value times the reps performed. So each element score is combined for a race, and that becomes the player's impact score for that race. And then, of course, that impact score accumulated across an entire match is the impact score for the match, or it's the season, or et cetera. So this impact score is the main one we're really going to be looking at today, and probably ongoing until we get some more data to fill in these entry to win percentages and things like that. So what is this element value? Let's head over to, and again, this is on our website, but we can see this match format called over under. It breaks down the elements within the races and applies the element values to them. So in the first 2 quadrants, there's 5 and 4 reps of each element, and they have an element value of 1. And then 3 and 4 has a lower quantity of reps, but each rep is more important because there's a lower quantity. So each one performed or messed up has a bigger impact. They're also heavier, so they're more difficult. So they have an element value of 2. And so you work your way down all of the different elements within the races. You see anywhere from 1 to 4, depending on difficulty, the weight, the time to perform in relation to the time of the race and things like that. So you can see how they vary. The most common is 1, but you have a good amount of 2s and 3s, a couple of 4s. Okay. So this is how we're trying to measure it. And I would highly encourage you to read through the article that talks about it a little bit if you have questions about it. And of course, you can always hit us up. But let's get into these assumptions that I had. Okay. I'm going to show you some of the statistics that have been coming out this week. But before I do, a quick disclaimer. And that is that this is our first iteration, and anything you do for the first time is, going to take some improvement, right? So we know that we're going to iterate this and improve upon it. But this is start. This is a start. We're getting what we need out of it as a start. Also, there's a ton of information, and if I showed you these spreadsheets, your eyes would cross all the formulas and things to aggregate the data. Shout out to Carissa, who's a former player and is helping her work her spreadsheet wizardry on this, because I do not have it, but it also takes a ton of time to double check. So again, I think the reason I mention that is because there is the likelihood that this is not 100% accurate at this stage. But the approach that we're taking is that we have at least a baseline to start articulating some of this information, and the top performances we can fairly easily double check. So we're going to, spend whatever time is reasonable as we build out these processes and systems that will help accuracy along the way and help better quantify these performances. And again, in a year or 2 or 3, we'll have a team of people on both lanes double checking and having, automated systems for a lot of this. But right now it's all manual, and we're doing what we can. So assumption number 1 that I am pretty wrong on was that a lot of these stats would reaffirm who we already thought were stars in the league. And so it's really pushing forward this concept of what does make a star in the league. Why do people gravitate to a single player's performances? And there are a lot of variables outside of reps performed. Well, this is going to wash all that away. And it's not like those things are going to go away. Of course, you're still going to have people that have, just a natural personality, or the type of movements they perform, or how they perform them, or the look that they have, or whatever it is that draws attention. You're still going to have all that, but you're also going to have the people that are their workhorses that might not be those flashiest players, but are really contributing in big ways to these team performances, that are now going to get the deserved recognition because these element values, these impact scores, are going to demonstrate the impact that they're having. This is really one of the things I'm most excited about. So of the top 5 players with impact scores across the entire first week in the Southern Conference, my guess is 2 of them you would expect and 3 you would not, which is really cool in my estimation. So that was assumption number 1. Again, also, there are some assumed top performers that are nowhere near the top in these element scores and values. So this is another way that's going to equalize out a little bit of performance in relation to who should get this recognition. So I'm really excited about that. So here's another assumption that I had, number 2, that is really based on the match programming thought process in me, I suppose. Like, I have programmed, or I have game planned for teams in the past. The Surge, I did a lot of it for those first 3 years. And so I understand the game planning side of this, but from a programming perspective, you kind of think about balance and how you're going to tax a team a similar way, so that, if a team is really strong in one thing, there's something to balance that out in another thing, and so I kind of assumed you'd see patterns across teams in how they execute on individual mass formats, because it's the same collection of movements, and of course, the same ones that have the same element values. And so I expected you'd see a very clear-cut pattern from team to team. And the fact is you don't. You might see a consistency from a few teams, but it really depends on the roster. And you do see some completely different outcomes in top impact scores from specific teams. And I'm going to show you some of this, but this was really very different than I expected. But here's what I love about it. Okay. So just like in football, when you can have a defensive-oriented team that's a shutdown defense, and they can win a championship with that strategy. You can also have a very offensive-oriented team, and they can win a championship. And you have to have some of each, totally, but you can have very specific focuses, and we all know teams in history that have, one way or the other, defense or offense. You also have teams that are very run-oriented, right? They run the ball all game, they pass, a lot less, and vice versa. You might have teams that don't run the ball at all that are dynasties, essentially, the Patriots, for example. So there's a ton of ways you can be a really successful team in football, and the same is true for Grid League. And I should have known this. I know this is a true team sport, right? But these impact scores are really solidifying that. They're verifying that is the case, and that's really exciting to me. So I'm going to show you a little bit of this data. So these are all impact scores across the entire Southern Conference for the first week. And I'm not going to show you names at this point, but I am going to show you position. I'm going to show you gender. And so let's look at over-under. And you are going to see some of these patterns a little bit that I mentioned. So utility player, strength specialist, utility player, your bodyweight specialist, okay? So there's your top 5. 4 are utility players. You got 1 strength specialist and 1 bodyweight specialist as your top performers in over-under, okay? So that is weighted a little bit towards utility player, which is the next assumption that I made. But this top performer on the strength specialist side was by far the top performer on her team, and they really leaned on her for the win, okay? And so some of these other utility players did not win. So this is, another one, this team also won that has this female bodyweight specialist. She's by far the top performer on her team. I'm sorry, she's not the top performer on her team. She's one of the top performers, the top 2, okay? But again, this is only true of that team because you don't see another bodyweight specialist for a couple spots down, and they were the 3rd best performer on their team, okay? So it's just showing different ways that teams are applying these specialists. Now here, I'm about to show you a roll-up, and this threw the 3rd assumption under the bus and just smashed it into pieces. That is that utility players would be favored in impact scores. So I assumed because utility players have a wider range of ability than a specialist, they're often performing a lot more reps, that they would have bigger impact scores. But what we're seeing when you look at roll-up is that the element value is offsetting for that. So any additional reps that a utility player is performing is offset by this element value, and you see bodyweight specialists rise to the top in roll-up. Okay? This is super cool and exciting to me because now we really see who the top performers are, and there isn't near as much of a bias towards the utility as I thought there would be. So it's kind of, you're really seeing the full impact that a player has. So I'm excited about this result because I didn't expect it at all. And you don't even see a utility player till number 7 on the list in these top performers of roll-up. So this strength specialist, again, was the top performer on her team, which happened to be the same team that you saw the strength specialist be the top performer in over-under, but it's a different player. And I love this because that team performed really well in both matches, but used completely different strategies, but favored strength specialists in both, and none of the other 3 teams did. Okay, so it just shows a different total strategy in how they came about it. Now, let's look at some of these weekend totals. So this is across the 2 matches, and it gets much more mixed up here. So you've got this again. These are complete totals between them. So you got a bodyweight specialist, utility player, bodyweight specialist, utility player, bodyweight specialist. So that favors bodyweight specialists and utility players until you get to slot 10, and then you have 3 strength specialists in a row. So of the top 11 performers, you have 3 strength specialists, 4 utility players, and 4 bodyweight players. Fairly even distribution. One of the other things about the Southern Conference that has been traditionally true that will be interesting to see once we see the Northern Conference stats applied to this is that pretty much all, I can't think of any off the top of my head, and forgive me if I'm incorrect. I can't think of any strength specialists of the year that came from the South. The North generally has strength specialists of the year as a part of it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And the South does typically win bodyweight specialist, except for Quentin, obviously. But the bodyweight specialists tend to be focused in the South. So we'll see how this plays out. But I expect that we'll see strength specialists rise, and it could also be somewhat of an inherent flaw in how the element value is applied currently that we may adjust in the future and see strength specialists rise even more. But very limited data pool at this point. It's just really interesting information to see at the top. So now, again, these top 5 players, my guess is you would guess 2 of them, but you would not guess the other 3. And then the other thing I want to showcase is the gender distribution. So we got female, male, female, male, 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 female, male, female, female, female. Pretty even. If you look at some of these other natural formats, male, female, male, male, female, male, female, 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 female. So pretty even across the top. And same is true of this one as well. It's fairly even. So I love that because it just shows how important both genders are across the board. And, I can't wait to show you guys who the players are and what the teams that have these players are. One crazy little thing that I never thought about, but is very evident when you have teams with a smaller roster than other teams, because we did have that disparity a little bit, the smaller roster does yield higher overall impact scores for the players that did participate, because there's less people for that work to be distributed on, right? So that's a pretty cool thing that I never thought about until seeing these stats. So what that means is when you have a full roster and the better the team is, high impact scores on those teams have even more significant value, because it says, we have players that can do this work, but these players are that much better, and we still went with them. So again, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but I'm really excited about this kind of stuff. I always debated about baseball stats and football stats growing up. And so, this is just taking the sport to another level, and I'm really excited about it. So thank you for watching and listening. We'll talk to you soon.